Some synesthetes perceive sex acts as colors too. Orgasm has been often described as violet, then fading into pink and yellow.
This is Exploring Unusual Sex, the podcast about odd stuff that helps understanding everyday matters. Our host today, from Milan, Italy, is author, journalist and personal coach Ayzad.
Welcome! In this episode we talk about women who marry monuments, molesting priests, the stinkiest club in the world, the limits of sex, and much more. Let's get starting, and the first topic is furries. We all know that sex is just a matter of personal tastes, that there is no point in talking about normality, and that even the most unusual preferences have the same dignity as the more common ones. Yet, all of this notwithstanding, you can't help it with furries. Merely mentioning them makes anyone who ever met one burst into a laugh, or perplexedly scratch their heads at the least. Furries, for your information, are people who identify as anthropomorphic animals like those you see in Disney movies or theme parks mascots. Often, these are just virtual avatars who interact between them in their special online communities, but in certain cases the character slips into the real world thanks to more or less elaborate costumes, generally called fursuits. Some of them are fine just sporting a hairband with fluffy cut ears, and others well full animatronic suits featuring masks capable of different expressions, radio-controlled tails, and more. But what has this got to do with sex? Well, that is a great question, because if you ask them, you will usually be told that no, it has nothing to do with it, although everyone has their own sexuality, so even furries can have one. Which sounds really sensible until you search for furry on Google, and the first 80 pages of results are all about porn featuring that sort of characters, erotic fanfictions, interspecies dating sites, and stuff like that. So, you go back to ask for some clarification, maybe referring to information from the For Science website, collecting all the surveys and scientific research ever done on the subject. And there, you find that no matter how hard the official statements claim that perverts, meaning those who leave out the sexual part of animalism, are undesirable exceptions, objective data tell another story. In particular, it turns out that the majority of furries is composed of queer white males under 25 who got bullied, and that in 40% of the cases they were attracted to the subculture by furry porn. 1 in 5 has purely erotic motivations, while the others also find pleasure in the community open-mindedness and typical creativity. And this is where you ask yourself why such denial of a reality. After all, there is nothing wrong in having fun with your kinky friends, is there? Just think that Anthrocon, the world's largest furry convention held in Pittsburgh, was attended by 9,300 persons, of which 2,400 were in a full fursuit. But the situation is not as sweet as it seems.
Let me interrupt you just a sec for an important reminder. The episode notes contain all the links to the topics mentioned in the podcast, and if you want to dig deeper, you will find hundreds of further articles on the Ayzad.com website.
Easter 2017 will go down in history for one of the most surreal events ever. The cancellation of a 1,600-strong Furries convention in Denver due to the misogynistic death threats against an activist instigated by the plushy neo-Nazi Fox Foxler and the subsequent boycott of the meeting by his goons. In case you were wondering, yes, the name is actually a portmanteau of Fox Hitler. The story is way too complicated to recap it here, but the point is that something is clearly broken in the world of furries. Fact is, its members do invest lots of emotionality in their alternative reality of anthropomorphic animals, and that much energy brings out all the people's best and worst. This is a phenomenon we have seen before in the early days of several other niche cultures, like for example comics, role-playing games, science fiction, gaming, and others. Kids who cannot integrate in regular daily life find acceptance in communities free of judgment and hungry for new elements, ready to tolerate even clearly unbalanced fellows just to grow in their size. With time, however, it is inevitable for pesky hierarchies and dynamics to mature inside this oasis too, just like in the outside world, and if you add the explosive power of the underlying erotic investment, some conflict is assured. One of the most chilling sentences I have ever heard came from a famous sexologist during a conference about paraphilias. Most pedophiles are not attracted by minors, he explained. The point is that they are scared by adults. Or, in other words, those with serious socialization issues express their libido wherever it finds the lesser resistance, like alternative sexualities that, after all, tickle everyone's fancy. They are based on powerful archetypes like domination, transformation, androgyny, ascesis. Of course it is easy to feel attracted by them. In some cases, that can even be a good idea. Like we said a few episodes ago, structured environments like the BDSM one harbor cultures that help diffuse self-destructive dynamics. The trick is to be aware of your own motivations though, because in other transgressive contexts, like the furry fandom, certain fetishisms or even extreme sports, libido gets sublimated and hidden into abstract forms. And how terribly hard must it be to move from thinking having a sex life is too risky, so I hide behind a plushie, to be accepted while I secretly masturbate over porn versions of Disney characters, to occasionally trying alternative identities on is fun, but I have learned to be happy in my own skin. Well, I suppose it is very hard indeed, especially if your starting point is the self-delusion of being there for an entirely different reason. Above all, thinking back to this old story, it is inevitable to ask how much of a furry approach is there in every one of us as we take on not only sex, but life in general. Who knows whether a bit of kink may be the ideal therapy we need.
The Sexual Explorers Manifesto is a global initiative to spread a healthier and more positive approach to sexuality. You can easily find it with an online search, but in the meantime, let's take a closer look at one of its 15 items. Today's one says:
The right to privacy is inviolable. The right to have one's privacy respected is always paramount, but it becomes even more important outside of a strictly sexual sphere, where every person must be considered exclusively for the qualities they express in that specific context. For example, to be private to somebody's sex life must play no influence whatsoever on their professional evaluation. The principle by which what you do in an erotic context shall not interfere with other environments extends to the right of maintaining, if you wish so, a separate identity for this purpose without being forced to publicly state your personal data.
This is your moment. In every episode, we pick one question among those sent to our expert at podcast@ayzad.com. So let's get writing to get an answer like this.
The very first email sent to Exploring Unusual Sex was from Fabiana, who said, "The episode about fetishisms was really interesting." Well, thanks Fabiana, but after a bit of online searching, I still have a doubt. Are objectophiles serious or what? First of all, let me explain what this is all about. Objectophilia isn't about generic objects, but unique inanimate structures, which usually are architectural works or monuments. It is a pretty odd fetishism, since not only it is among the few to be almost exclusively female, but it is also expressed with sincere romantic love for the structure in question. The most famous case, about which they even wrote a musical, is that of Erika Labrie, an Olympic archery champion who, after foiling a rape attempt while serving in the US aviation by using a training sword, developed an addiction to objects that gave her a feeling of protection. The lady maintains she fell in love with the Eiffel Tower in 2004 and she married it in 2007 in an official ceremony, even changing her legal family name into Eiffel. She was better off than Asia Rita Berliner Mauer, who married the Berlin Wall in 1979 and saw it butchered before her eyes 10 years later. It is thought that this fetishism is an unusual collateral effect of Asperger's syndrome, which is a minor form of autism causing a synesthetic collision between objects and people, with roughly 80 known cases. So the answer is yes, they are definitely serious. But it is interesting to note that objectophiles observe how in most non-European cultures it is normal to believe that objects have a soul, and while realizing their oddity, they also find natural to entertain this sort of love stories. Actual sexual intercourse between partners, though, seems to be optional. After solving this doubt too, I want to remind everyone that sex should always be a pleasure, not a problem, even when it is uncommon. However, if you are experiencing issues, I can help you as a personal coach to discover together the ideal strategy to win back your happiness in this field. You can get in touch through my website ayzad.com, spelled Ayzad, and saying you are a listener of this podcast will earn you a 20% discount on the first session.
This episode is almost over, but we still have time to read one entry from XXX, the Dictionary of Unusual Sex, available in online bookstores everywhere, but in Italian only for the moment.
Today's entry is capnolagnia. It looks like the association between cigars and power can be traced back to the 19th century, when getting hold of them and allowing yourself the time to smoke one and unhurriedly enjoy it, maybe in the fumoir of a gentleman's club, was a luxury reserved to the highest class members. Anyway, it doesn't take Freud to notice the phallic symbology of these items, which in fact turn out to be a pretty common fetish, especially in the gay world. An example so blatant to be ridiculous is the Hot Ash Club in New Orleans, where burly men meet to smoke monster cigars as large as your arm, blow carcinogenic puff in each other's faces, and commit impure acts with the ashtray's contents. Slightly less exaggerated and definitely more spectacular are the infamous porn show of certain thigh clubs, whose artists manage to smoke cigars via their vaginas, even puffing perfect smoke rings. These and many other forms of sex games involving cigars fall under the definition of capnolagnia, and they can be more dangerous than they look. In fact, experts warn that inserting a cigar in the anus or vagina, their mucous lining will rapidly absorb nicotine, which is poisonous above certain quantities. And should you ever get elected as President of the United States, remember Bill Clinton was kicked out of office exactly for these pastimes. And that really was it. Before leaving you with one last unusual sex fact, I want to thank you for listening and invite you to follow me on my social networks and above all on my website, ayzad.com, which is also the ideal place to sign up for my newsletter. That way you'll get straight in your inbox new articles, reviews, invitations to events, and the notification for new podcast episodes which you can listen to and comment pretty much everywhere, like iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Spreaker, and so on. If you liked exploring unusual sex, I would also like to invite you to fill the Tell Me About You form you can find linked in the episode notes, so you will help me make the next episodes even better and closer to your tastes. Finally, you can also lend a hand by telling your friends about this podcast and writing about it on your social networks. Thanks, and before moving on to the next episode, here's the fact I promised you. In 2009, Archbishop Silvano Tomasi stated that no more than 5% of the Catholic clergy is involved in child abuse. Pity that, in that year, 412,970 priests were active worldwide, for a total of about 21,000 known pedophiles protected by the Vatican.